Hello everybody, and welcome for today's video. Now, today is going to be a bit of a different take, as last time I talked about Gloomwood, and this time we're going to talk about Warhammer 40k. Now, if you don't know, Warhammer 40k is a sci-fi setting set in the far future owned by Games Workshop, and it's relatively one of my hobbies. However, this isn't going to be a Warhammer 40k lore video. There's plenty of channels that talk about Warhammer lore in general, and I don't feel, well, I'm not going to go into that part yet because there's already enough channels. So instead, we're going to talk about factions. Now, see, recently there is a faction that I'm really personally hoping that will be added in. It's hinted that they might be, but it's unlikely. And this video will be focusing on their detachments, their possible rules on tabletop, what their models might look like, and in general their main lore. And that faction is the Dark Mechanicum. Now, if I can to communicate the idea, and if you want some lore, I'll put some links to various videos that talk about the Dark Mechanicum's lore. They're not a faction that's there on the tabletop yet, but hopefully they probably will be added in. So yeah, I'm gonna put that in there in the bottom description. So to know about the Dark Mechanicum are sort of the Chaos aligned opposite of the Adeptus Mechanicus. However, they are fundamentally quite different to their counterparts. Although some may call them a mirror, where they worship machines and they sort of worship machines itself and they follow the Omnissiah, the Dark Mechanicum in general sort of just strive to innovate, but we'll get into like their big differences. So to give you a quick rundown about the lore, in the old times, the Mechanicus were the producers of technology. Despite being a religious sect for the Imperium of Man, they were fundamentally an important group. Eventually, though, there were restrictions on technology that they weren't allowed to research, and this sort of boiled over in their general scientific curiosity. As such, when the Civil War, otherwise known as the Horus Heresy, broke out, a large sect of the Mechanicum sided with Horus, which would later be known as the Dark Mechanicum. These groups saw that they threw off the chains of what was restricting their innovations and inventions and proceeded to focus on dark science. Eventually, they were defeated, much similar to Horus, and they were cast into the Eye of Terror, in which they have remained there ever since. Although now it is rumoured that they are coming out and starting to strike out a lot more confidently. Now, in ideals, comparatively, you could argue, what is the difference between an Adeptus Mechanicus and a Dark Mechanicum? I mean, a Dark Mechanicum, or a Dark Mech as I'm going to call them, would often wear black robes, while an Ad Mech, or the Adeptus Mechanicus, often wear bright red priestly robes. And of course, the argument about that differences is kind of funny, it's like, aren't they like the same thing? Because there are memes about like the Dark Mechanicum are like OSHA compliant or exactly the same, but I do think there is a huge difference between the two factions. The Adeptus Mechanicus regularly are what I call, well, they're assholes, but they're selfless. Their pursuit of technology and knowledge is always under for the betterment of humanity. They always view themselves as doing it the right way, even though there's evidence that they're doing it completely wrong, because the technology they gain access to would better humanity. The Dark Mech, on the other hand, they get technology for themselves. They only care about what they can use technology for, and they would even go far as innovating, because it's not like, how can I make this more useful for me? How can I improve it? And interestingly enough about the Dark Mech, I have to add on to them, is that although they are very important in the lore to how many of the factions of Chaos is able to function. I know sometimes some critics in the lore of Warhammer 40k will often talk about like, how do Chaos Space Marines are able to get like new Space Marines, or how do Chaos even still continues to be somewhat successful despite them taking losses, and that's the Dark Mechanicum. The Dark Mechanicum are their factory producers. They produce their war machines, their guns, their weapons, heck, they even produce new aspirants. Some of the most horrifying devices Chaos has ever built in Warhammer 40k, there is literally an 80% chance that the Dark Mechanicum built it themselves. other times it's Fabius Bile, but he's a different character that I don't think we should talk much about. But the idea is that the Dark Mechanicum are the inventors. They are the ones responsible for what is built. Now, what's making it interesting is the Dark Mechanicum don't rarely show off their forces much in current lore. Oftentimes when we do get to see the Dark Mechanicum, it's often in the operation as cults in the services of various war bands. And we don't normally, I don't think, haven't yet seen a Hellforge yet completely, or what many of their war machines or devices would actually look like. But it doesn't mean that is impossible. It doesn't mean that it's likely there is never going to be a chance for an army. There is some confirmation we do have of what their army would likely look for, and how a Dark Mechanicum army would operate. It's very likely they could operate as a cult on the Mechanicus world, or there could be a fleet looking for STCs and lost tech in order for them to use it and incorporate on their own machines. It could not even be an exile who's just simply looking out to make his own Hellforge or their Hellforge, as they have been exiled from their own world. Or they could just be looking for captives or materials to fuel their forges. It's often a large amount. What I really hope is that if they are added into the game, that their models would sort of showcase this need to recycle. As mentioned, the Dark Mechanicum don't usually have a lot of resources, and they're not what I call very good with making resources. They rely on a lot of raiding and piracy and all of that type of stuff. So even if they do have an army, I'm expecting it to, or hoping that it looks like something from the film Virus, in effect where it's a mixture between man and machine, and they all have like weird cybernetics, and the machines look much more weirder, and like the Scutari don't have like mechanical parts. They also have like bits that are like bone that they're using to replace some of their limbs, because they have to recycle everything, which including all the fleshy bits from all dead creatures and everything, which is likely they will have a flesh-like appearance that most of the demon engines we see in the Chaos range. The understanding idea I have for them is that they are effectively a horde-based army with a lot of demon engines, but we should get past that part and cut down to the main meat of the video. So the main meat of this video is that the Dark Mechanicum as an army, their main mechanic would likely be a mix of power from Pain combined with Altar of the Damned from the Chaos Knights and from the Jakari, but vice versa. Effectively, when you're feeling a Dark Mech army, every unit will have these levels of power to them. Level 1, 2 to 3, or level 1 to 6. It depends on what unit. Bigger units have a higher level, lower units have a lower level. For example, a unit of, let's say, Dark Scutari would have maybe 2 levels, while a Demon Engine would probably have 3 to 4 levels. And with each level, each level can be activated to give a unique passive ability that would improve their performance in battle. Now, how to empower this is relatively simple. Killing. Effectively, whenever your units die, or enemy units die, if there is like someone who is able to be a ritualist, say like a Dark Mechanicum Adept or Dark Mechanicum Magos, they can harvest or harness the war life essence to fuel and empower their machines and inventions. Now you could argue, oh, this sounds pretty useful, this sounds pretty good. However, the power level, depending on what level you have, will always reduce by 1 per turn. So you gotta keep on keeping the power up, because they will get depowered over time. However, what makes it even more dangerous is this very insidious fact, is that if it's above level 3, you have to make a leadership test or that unit will receive damage. And if it's much more higher levels, that the chances of that leadership test will become increasingly more likely to fail, or you just might receive immediate damage if that level is decreased, or the unit will blow up if you're at level 6. This is really mostly to reflect on how the Dark Mechanicum tends to abuse a lot of their war machines, because they don't want to focus on harmony with all their machines. They don't want to build this harmonious, well-rounded machine. They want to abuse the inventions they use and push them to their purest limit. However, there's sort of a risk to it, because if you push too far, well, all your inventions and all your momentum will blow up, and it can go down into a pretty bad side. So it's really a power game balance. You've got to balance that momentum up. You've got to make sure that it's all working well, and if you fail to maintain it, well, goodbye your units, because all your units are going to die. Now, the main idea of this army, and as we go down to units, is that the army makeup is divided into 4 categories: Dark Adepts, War Machines, Dark Scutari, and Thralls. Now, the first one is, of course, Dark Adepts. These are your leaders, your ritualists, the tech priests themselves, or heretics as they would be often called. Now, these guys can vary from being a master of their own Hellforge, or just simply a servant or pawn to the main Dark Mechanicum leader they follow. Their composition can often vary a lot, as many Dark Mechanicum aren't usually alike, and as such they can all have different fields of specialties, but they also can provide a unique flavour to different armies that they're leading, connected to their field of specialty. They are the ones who can conduct the rituals, and they are the ones that empower the war machines, and they really are important because you have to sort of spread them out in your field of battle, though you can of course expand how much their power is able to, conduct their rituals needed to empower your war machines. Now the second one, and the most important fact, is the war machines. These are, well, demonic engines. These are they can vary from terrifying demonic engines such as defilers or brass scorpions, and you can even feel units from Chaos Space Marines, which are often demonic engines, such as the Defiler, the Venom Crawler, and the Forge Fiend, I think? Yeah, the Forge Fiend, as well as many more. They also have a brand new whole bunch of newer demonic units that are specifically tied to the Dark Mechanicum, and these Chaos engines can be quite unique. They can be quite terrifying, and they often have various sets of powers. And basically, they can field almost any Chaos engine from almost any army, because they are the manufacturers of that. And of course, their war machines do gain the benefit of the empowering ability where they can get empowered. I'm also hoping that they might have the new Stalker from the Horus Heresy, because it's very likely they'll have one of those in, but a bit more fleshy. A bit more like with little fleshy bits on it. The next unit is the Dark Scutari. Now, the Dark Scutari aren't confused to be with the regular Scutari, as they're more like cybernetically enhanced monsters. They are very monsters looking. They're very, sometimes they might even have like automatons or robots serving their legions. Heck, it's very likely they might have chaos androids as the elite guard of the unit. Though it is also likely the chaos android might be some kind of weird demon host battery unit, as recent lore has seemed to be pointing that the chaos android is serving that role. But it's also likely that they have robotic troops. This is your elite infantry, the infantry that you send forward to handle a lot of messes, protect the war machines, and overall maintain the hold on objectives and everything. And the last one is the most important unit, but of course that's seen as useless by their masters, are thralls and cults. These are individuals who have been unfortunately kidnapped, or likely the workers of Hellforges, and have been enhanced with the various cybernetics in order to fight in battle. The Dark Mechanicum are above none of losing slaves as their fighters, and it's very likely they would basically collect some cult members and give them some cool cybernetics and then send them forward to fight. Now, the Thralls are Horde. They're basically a huge amount of units. They are specifically built to overwhelm their enemies with their vicious cybernetics, but they're also there to be sacrificed, because you can literally sacrifice the units if you want to maintain energy. And as such, they are seen as expendable. However, they can field special war machines that are inspired by the penitent engines that the Sisters of Battle use. After all, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and I can definitely see the Dark Mechanicum not messing up the opportunity to just get more pain and suffering. And they definitely will have their own thralls connected to these engines, which they use to fight in their battles. And they are basically not treated that quite well, but they are seen as useful. They are useful but expendable. Now, of course, with this huge focus on sacrifice, there would also be detachments to tie in with such an army. Now, these detachments are, well, I'll put them in simply and explain them. first one I had in mind was Cyber Legion. Effectively, this is a huge focus on mechs, machines, and maybe chaos androids if they added them in the army as the elite guard. And they're very tough, they're able to move quite effectively, they're able to be quite damaging, and they are effectively very good strong tanks. It's really much better improved infantry. The second is Hellforge Masters, which is basically improving your empowering ability, able to get like the units to be empowered a lot better and more effectively. Next one is Techno Cult, or Heretic Cult, which basically focuses a lot on thralls, but you can actually sacrifice the thralls to unlock special rituals that are only tied into this detachment, such as summonings and machine creations and alike, and many more. Next is Scrap Code Infiltrators, which are like units focused on spreading scrap code. And the next one is Cult of Obliviation, which is a special cross detachment unit, as it's only the few armies where you can actually field Obliviators from the Chaos Space Marines range, including the Warp Smith, and you can field like Mutilators, Obliviators into your own army. Because, if you look in the lore, the Obliviator virus has a lot in common with the Dark Mechanicum themselves. The next and final one is the Infernal March, which is also a detachment where it's Dark Mechanicum and Chaos Knights, as Chaos Knights often have ties to Dark Mechanicum worlds, and I can definitely see the Dark Mechanicum not messing up the opportunity to use these gigantic and powerful war engines for their own sinister purposes, which I think is pretty fitting. These Chaos Knights would gain the special empowerment ability where they can be empowered, and the Dark Mechanicum can gain the Idolator role in order to effectively improve them. You can also have a Chaos Knight be in charge of your army if you want, and effectively they are a pretty unique detachment. I think that would be sort of a unique detachment added into the game. I also had another idea, and this is possibly a maybe, because I'm also hoping, but it's very unlikely, that the Dark Mechanicum might also have cybernetic enhanced demons, much similar to the lore of Doom. Though I am unsure about that. It is a possibility that they would have demons they put bound in cybernetic, but I also likely that these would possibly belong to Bashtor the Archithane, and that's really about it on the units. But there is one more segment I want to talk about, which is possibly Crusade rules. Okay, so Crusade rules focus fundamentally, it's basically a long-term campaign that you can play in Warhammer 40k, and it's very likely nearly every army has this. For the Dark Mechanicum, I won't go into too much details about this. It's generally the idea of how they work. They often will follow the typical trend as most Crusades, but the idea is here. If you're leading a Dark Mechanicum Crusade, the main goal is really to create your Doomsday weapon. Effectively, there is a tree of resources that need to be managed. Your Hellforge, which would be your Doomsday weapon workshop, and the weapon you want to build in itself. And effectively, with every battle and victory you win, or every possible agenda accomplished, it brings you one step closer to building that Doomsday weapon to release onto the galaxy itself. This could be something simple as a powerful virus. It could be a bomb that, turns people into robots. It could be almost anything. Anything you can think of in sci-fi as a Doomsday weapon can be used. And that would be what the Dark Mechanicum wish to build. Now, as you progress in the game, you can improve your inventions of all your units, improving the efficiency as you upgrade through the Hellforge, and over time you're building this massive Doomsday weapon to be unleashed. And then you can use said weapon in the battlefield. Effectively, let's say you're fighting, an army of Space Marines, and you built the Hammer of Dawn. You can fire that on the whole army on the Space Marines as a unique ability. That's effectively what I think the idea of the Crusade rules are for the Dark Mechanicum. I know it's a pretty short segment, but this video is mostly concept ideas, and I wanted to keep it relatively a short one. So, in conclusion, I do think the Dark Mechanicum would be one hell of a fun faction to be added. This video, as mentioned before, was primarily existed to really give my take on what I think the rules of them would look like, combined with how they would likely play on the army tabletop. Now, it's also unlikely that we might get this year. I'll be surprised if they do like a reveal after this video is made about the Dark Mech are coming, here they are, here's the new models. But if that's the case, well, that's exciting. And like I said, the dark mech, I know some people probably don't want them to be all that fleshy like in Virus, but the reason I talk about this is mostly to speak about the Heretic dark mech, as the Heretic ones seem to be more succumb to fleshiness and warp mutation and all that. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that all Dark Mechanicus are like, chaos aligned. It's very likely we probably might get a range where they're sort of in the more middle ground, but it's very likely, more likely, that we will get the chaos aligned Dark Mech, because that's usually the most widely recognized faction in 40k that is also large enough to be its own power base. But yeah, if the Dark Mech are added, I think that would be a pretty cool thing. And in general for Dark Mech characters, yeah, I think that would be possibly quite fun. And yeah, if anyone wants me to make my own personal opinions on the Dark Mech themselves, as like in general how they fit in 40k lore, I'll be happy to do that, though this is possibly going to be just a one-off video. But yeah, and again, thank you for all the comments. Thank you for everyone for watching this anyway. And yeah, this is just one of many different videos I'm planning on making. But yeah, I hope everyone has a lovely day, and yeah, good day.